All right, thank you. We're going to continue with the last segment of the open session. There are 4 working groups of council. One of them is Genomics and Society. And among other things, one of the things that these working groups do is provide advice about in this case, the LC research program. A requirement for all working groups is to make at least once a year a report to the full council. And Malia Fullerton, who is the chair of the LC Working Group, is going to give the presentation today. Malia is professor and interim chair of bioethics and humanities at the University of Washington School of Medicine. And as I mentioned, she is the current chair. So Malia, you want to go ahead, please?
All right. Thank you so much, Rudy. And good afternoon, everyone. I am acutely aware that you are well behind. And so I'm going to do my best to keep my presentation short today, but certainly welcome your questions and comments at the end of my presentation. So yes, I am reporting out on behalf of the Genomics and Society Working Group. Just as a reminder, the GSWG's mission is to provide the National Advisory Council advice on short and long-term planning and priority setting for genomics and society activities at the NHGRI, particularly as they involve the ethical, legal, and social implications, or ELSI, research program. The GSWG, which meets approximately quarterly, about 3 times a year, and then we actually had an in-person meeting this year back in May, a 2-day meeting, which was marvelous to be back in person with everyone. And during those meetings, we provide input about the ELSI research priorities. We advise on the appropriate balance between investigator and program-initiated research, and we sometimes comment on the best use of limited budgetary and staff resources. These are the same mission that I presented last year. This is just a quick depiction of our current working group members. I actually serve as co-chair now of the work group with my colleague Kyle Brothers, who I know is there in the room with you all. And we are joined by this fabulous group of ELSI scholars from around the United States. We had 3 new members last year, but we now have a steady cohort, and we have really been having some marvelous conversations over the course of the last year. Just as a reminder, I presented around this time last year in September at the September 2022 council meeting, where the primary take-home messages of my presentation were the insights from the working group that ELSI research should be playing a guiding role in efforts for the NHGRI in terms of addressing structural inequities as they involve genomics research. We advised and counseled about prioritizing population level analyses, including responsible incorporation of social determinants of health, and also sustained community involvement in research, as well as consideration of health equity. And we argued that broadening ELSI expertise to include new perspectives would be particularly important. So that's just a very, very high level reminder of where we landed in my presentation last year. It probably will come to no surprise to any of you listening to my presentation that these same ELSI research priorities continue. And that's great because we're pressed for time. I can kind of speed through those. And if anybody has questions or wants additional information, you can go back to the video from last September and hear more detail about each of these continuing ELSI research priorities. But we also have, over the course of the past year, also begun to have detailed conversations, both focusing on diversity in the ELSI research portfolio itself, as well as really having some sustained conversation in direct relationship to and as a follow-up of the National Academy's Population Descriptors Report that I imagine that most people who are present today are familiar with. So that's where we've been kind of focusing our efforts. I'll just quickly remind you about some of these continuing or ongoing research priorities and then move to a discussion of some of these newer topics. Really, health equity remains a central concern for the Genomics and Society Working Group. Same concerns as were discussed last year about questions that we've asked today being similar to those asked decades ago, and our continuing insistence and insight that even though enhanced workforce diversity, which we know is a major priority for the Institute, is incredibly important, that genomics cannot rely solely on people from underrepresented groups to break down research and translational barriers in this space. In part, with health equity as a sort of centering emphasis for the working group, we continue to feel as though, particularly for the ELSI research program, that emphasis on structural factors, structural racism, will continue to be incredibly important. The ELSI research program, of course, had been reorganized last year to highlight research areas related to these broader topics. And we continue to look for and search for ways that ELSI can attract more scholars with expertise in structural inequities, and in particularly thinking about social justice in the context of genomics research. Along the lines of that prior emphasis and prior ELSI research priority, at the request of the Genomics and Society Working Group, NHGRI staff were able to provide a preliminary analysis of data that had been extracted in the context of two different portfolio analyses. One focused on minority health and health disparities research as it's been conducted and funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute, and a second focused on research and institutional diversity within the ELSI program itself. The measures of diversity that were included in this preliminary portfolio analysis included measures of project diversity, including diversity-related RCDC. This is the research categories, disease categories, health that are used by the NIH to categorize data, health disparities research, minority health research, as well as institutional measures such as minority serving institutions, or whether a grant is funded in a state that is funded through the Institutional Development Awards mechanism, prioritizing grantees in states that do not have as much success with NIH grants. Future analyses are planned to supplement these initial preliminary investigations to include investigator measures as is available. This will require data use agreements, though, and so it's still in progress. But this was really incredibly interesting. I know it took a huge amount of work on the part of the couple of staff members who were involved. But the preliminary findings provoked really rich discussion within the working group about ways to continue to monitor and promote diversity moving forward. I think there was broad recognition that we aren't going to be able to maximize and enhance diversity in the ELSI research portfolio without understanding where we are currently in that regard. And so it was an extremely interesting and helpful exercise. So I wanted to share that out with everyone, so you're aware that we were having that discussion earlier in the year. Another priority that we brought forward from the previous year was continuing to worry about genomics research that is expanded beyond traditional health-focused applications. For example, research focused in sociogenomics, forensic uses, and continue to think about the best ways to support the rest of the genomics research community in combating misinformation that can occasionally accompany studies of this kind. The ELSI research priority, gene and environment interaction, received, I think, a fair amount of attention in my presentation last year. There, of course, now has been a new RFA looking at result return in the context of such investigations. And we continue to be really interested in this question as a work group, both because of the concern about moving ethics considerations, ethical and normative considerations, away from individual concerns to population level concerns, but also because we recognize that many environmental risk factors are very different from the kinds of risk factors that we normally think about in the context of genetic research, where they are not under individual control. And so they lead us to be thinking in sort of broader policy terms. And that brings up a range of new ethical and normative considerations that we hope the ELSI community will have a central role in helping to kind of think critically about moving forward. And then, of course, social determinants of health, which is an LC priority that I led with last year, still very much relevant. It's come up, I think, in a number of the concept presentations that I was listening to as I was waiting to come on right now. It's definitely a live concern in some of the consortia that I'm working with. Improving work on this is going to allow us to avoid genomic determinism, and also is going to push us in the direction of broader community interaction and engagement. Last year, at the time that I was discussing this as an LC research priority, we were all eagerly awaiting the outcome of the National Academy's deliberations on population descriptors. That report, of course, is now out and has been out for quite some time, came out earlier this year. I don't have time, and it's not appropriate for me to be kind of rehearsing all of the recommendations, but I think probably many of you are aware that the committee deliberated and actually presented the research community with 13 recommendations, beginning with avoiding typological thinking, directly evaluating environmental risk factors, engaging communities, tailoring population descriptors and uses to the types and purposes of study, and really calling out funders, professional societies, and journal editors for particular kind of help, I would say, in enacting the recommendations that were made by this hardworking group. Along those lines, the NHGRI has recently launched an explainer, which is available out on the internet, called The Use of Population Descriptors in Genomics. An early draft of this explainer, which was initially developed as the NASEM report was being drafted, was brought to the Genomics and Society work group for feedback, and we provided some discussion and feedback that I believe were ultimately quite helpful. It's a very nice page. We have not yet, as a work group, had a chance to kind of sit down and kind of formally evaluate it now as it's live and out in the world, but it seems to be doing much of the work that we were hoping it would do in the context of our prior discussions. The explainer addresses topics such as, what are population descriptors? How do genetic ancestry, race, and ethnicity fit together in the context of genomic research? How well can we determine genetic ancestry? How should we be thinking about population descriptors? Are they social constructs? Why should researchers be intentional about this? And why does the NHGRI care about this issue? Anyway, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at this, I strongly recommend that you check it out. The very bottom of the explainer page, there is this sentiment which is expressed, which I wanted to accentuate and highlight here, which is that understanding the true role that genomics plays in health and wellness is going to require careful attention to the full spectrum of contributing factors, including genomic, biological, as well as clinical traits, components of the natural built or social environment in which people live, and larger systemic or structural issues. Clarity and specificity around population descriptors used in genomic research can improve the scientific integrity of research while also showing respect for the people represented in our genomic research studies. So really great and really wonderful to see some of the language and kind of the recommendations and the spirit of some of the things that we've been talking about in the Genomics and Society work group represented so well in this page. Because the GSWG has had a fair amount of discussion and deliberation about the population descriptors recommendations, we did decide as a group that we wanted to make several formal recommendations about the ways in which we would hope that Council would respond to those recommendations that have been made. The first recommendation is that we request that the Council considers requiring applicants to explain and justify their use of population descriptors, as is recommended in the report, within grant applications as appropriate. The second recommendation is to consider how best to incentivize the adoption of the recommendations by investigators as well as research consortia. There are resources and tools which are already foundational to the genomics discipline, and those that are foundational or widely utilized would ideally be prioritized to respond proactively to the NASA recommendations. And third, and finally, to consider support of novel research, which would be designed to foster the development of new research frameworks and methods, in particular related to this concept of genetic similarity, which was introduced and proposed in the context of the report as an alternative way of conceptualizing population similarity and difference in preference to genetic ancestry. Collaborative teams could include both genomic scientists and ELSI researchers in this kind of novel research as appropriate. So those are the recommendations that my colleagues have asked me to convey to you all today. Just to wrap up, hopefully I haven't taken too long. ELSI priorities continue to focus on considerations of health equity, social justice, and responsible collection and use of social determinants of health in conjunction with genomic research. But these new recommendations for the use of population descriptors are now codified, and the GSWG urge Council to consider how best to ensure for their rapid implementation. Continuing efforts to collect data on diversity in the NHGRI, ELSI, as well as other research portfolios would be very welcome. And then just a note, every couple of years we have a National ELSI Congress. The sixth version of this is going to be happening next June 10th to 12th at Columbia University in New York City, and we warmly invite anyone who might be present there who has an interest in these topics to present their work and to attend the Congress. Thank you so much. Happy to take questions if there's time.
Thank you, Malia. Are there questions from the council or comments? No? Okay. Crystal clear, Malia. Thank you very much. And we appreciate
All right.
your
Thank you very
being
much,
patient with
everyone.
us.